There's a passage in the book of Enoch that names a place, not a symbol, not a metaphor, a place, with a direction and a description, where a system of rulers is born that the text says will one day stand against God himself. Most people who've read about the Antichrist have never read this passage. They know the idea from Revelation, from Daniel, from centuries of sermons and film. But centuries before any of that, one book already told you where he comes from and who's ruling there right now. You already carry an image of the Antichrist, a man, a leader, someone who rises out of nowhere at the end of history and deceives the world. That image comes from later interpretation, stitched together from fragments across the New Testament. But it's not where the concept starts. It starts here, in a book so old that by the time Revelation was written, this text was already ancient. And what it describes isn't a man who appears at the end. It's a system that's been operating since the beginning, waiting for its moment. Here's the part most people miss. The Book of Enoch doesn't just describe that system. It gives it a location, and it gives it a name. Somewhere in this text, ancient enough to predate most of the Bible you've read, there is an answer to the question of who is actually running the place the Antichrist comes from. Not a title, not a metaphor, a name. Attached to one specific being, the text holds responsible for all of it. You'll have it by the end of this video, and once you do, the rest of what you think you know about this figure is going to look different. The Book of Enoch was excluded from most Bibles centuries ago, but it survived complete in Ethiopia and in fragments among the Dead Sea Scrolls found at Qumran. Scholars have had access to it for over a century. What it says about the origin of ultimate evil and about who's in charge of that origin has been sitting in plain sight the entire time, mostly ignored because it doesn't match the picture people expect. Tonight, we go through it in order: where it comes from, who runs it, what it wants, and who, specifically, the text says answers for it. Start with the assumption everyone makes. The Antichrist is one person, a single figure who shows up, takes power, and brings the world to its knees. The Book of Enoch never describes a lone figure like that. Instead, across chapters 38 through 53, it describes a recurring group it calls the kings and the mighty, rulers, plural, wealthy men who reject the Lord of Spirits, who build their power on what they own rather than on righteousness, and who persecute the people the text calls the righteous and the elect. This group isn't introduced once and dropped. It reappears across the parables of Enoch as a standing category, a type of power that exists in every generation, not a villain who arrives at the end of time, a pattern that has always been running, and that the text says will reach its final form before the end. That reframes everything. If the Antichrist is a system rather than a single man, then the real question isn't who will he be, it's where does a system like that come from? And the Book of Enoch doesn't leave that question open. It gives you an address. Notice what just happened to the question you walked in with. You wanted a face. The text just took it away and handed you a pattern instead, one you're going to recognize pieces of before this is over. Earlier in the book, in the section called the Book of the Watchers, Enoch is taken on a guided tour of the physical structure of the world. And in chapters 18 and 21, he's shown something specific, a place in the West. Not symbolic West, not spiritual West, a direction he's physically led toward. A burning valley, filled with columns of fire, sulfur, and a chasm so deep, the text says it reaches down beneath the pillars of heaven itself. This is where the fallen watchers, the angels who abandoned their post and corrupted humanity, are bound until judgment. Enoch doesn't call it hell in the later Christian sense. He calls it a prison, built into the architecture of the earth, holding beings who are the direct ancestors of the corruption the kings and the mighty represent. The connection matters because the text ties the two together. The corrupt human rulers aren't operating independently. Their pattern of power, wealth, defiance, oppression, descends from the same rebellion that put those angels in that valley in the first place. The Antichrist system doesn't have a metaphorical origin. According to this text, it has a physical one. A location Enoch says he stood in front of. You've probably pictured evil as something without an address, something that exists everywhere and nowhere at once. Enoch doesn't let you have that. He's telling you the thing you assumed was formless has coordinates. But a place doesn't explain power on its own. A prison holds beings who've already lost. The kings and the mighty haven't lost anything yet. So where does their power actually come from, while they're still free to use it? Chapter 46 gives the answer directly, and it's not what you'd expect from an apocalyptic text. The kings and the mighty aren't described primarily as violent, or even as explicitly satanic. The text says their power rests upon their riches. It says they set their hope on the gods they've made with their own hands, gods built from gold and silver, and they deny the name of the Lord of Spirits. Read that again. The corrupting force isn't just wickedness in the abstract. It's the object of worship shifting from something beyond you to something you built and own. The text is describing idolatry, but it's specifically describing wealth as idolatry. Power that runs on possession instead of principle. This is the part of the prophecy that stops sounding like ancient mythology and starts sounding uncomfortably current. The Antichrist system, as Enoch describes it, isn't a throne room somewhere far away. It's a logic. Whatever runs on the worship of what you can buy and own, at the expense of the people underneath it, is already operating on the same fuel the text describes. The valley in the west is where it was born, but the riches are where it's been living ever since. In every generation, the text says this pattern repeats in. You've lived your entire life in a world that measures security by what can be owned. That's what makes this description land the way it does. Enoch isn't describing a mechanism from some other era. You already know this mechanism. You've felt it decide who gets listened to and who doesn't. And if it's been operating quietly across every generation, feeding on the same source, the next question is unavoidable. How far does its reach actually extend? Chapter 46, verse 7, goes further than describing what the kings and mighty worship. It describes how they act because of it. The text says, "They judge the stars of heaven, they raise their hands against the Most High, and they tread upon the earth and dwell upon it, as though the ground itself is their possession." That's not a description of a single tyrant seizing a throne. It's a description of ownership treated as identity. Rulers who behave as though dominion over the physical world is simply theirs by default, who position themselves as judges, even over the order of the heavens. This is where the Book of Enoch's picture starts lining up with a phrase most people have only heard in a New Testament context, the idea of Satan as the ruler of this world. Enoch was written centuries before that language existed, and it's already describing the same structure. Not a being who invades Earth from outside, but a system that has treated the Earth as rightfully its own territory since the beginning, defending that ownership against anything higher than itself. Think about the assumptions you've absorbed about who the world actually belongs to, about whose claim on it goes unquestioned. Enoch is telling you that claim was never neutral. Somebody has been treating ownership of this place as settled, and daring anyone to say otherwise. If a system believes the earth already belongs to it, it doesn't behave like an intruder. It behaves like a landlord, and landlords don't expect eviction, which is exactly what the next chapters of Enoch say is coming for them. Everything up to this point has been about how the system operates while it's winning. Chapters 62 and 63 are about what happens when it stops winning. The text describes the kings and the mighty brought before a figure it calls the Son of Man, seated on the throne of glory. And in that moment, the same wealth that built their power becomes useless. The text says they will seek to fall down and worship before him, pleading for mercy, and they will not obtain it. Their faces will be filled with shame, and the same riches that let them tread on the earth and judge the stars will not purchase them a single moment of escape. This is the payoff the entire system has been building towards since the valley in the west. Everything that made them untouchable on earth, the gold, the ownership, the ability to act as though the world was theirs, evaporates the instant they're standing in front of something they can't own. Enoch doesn't describe this as a battle. He describes it as an unveiling. The power was always borrowed. The judgment is where that becomes visible to everyone, including them. You already know what it feels like to trust something that turns out to hold no weight when it actually gets tested. Enoch is telling you that's what's waiting at the end of every system built the way this one is built. Not defeat by force. Exposure. That closes the case on where this system comes from and what happens to it. But there's a question the title asks that we haven't answered yet, and Enoch has been building toward it the entire time without saying the name out loud. If this is a system, who's actually running it? Go back to the valley. The text doesn't leave the beings bound there unnamed. In chapter 6, it names the leader of the angels who descended and started this entire chain of corruption, Semjaza, and in chapter 10, it goes further. It singles out one figure by name and holds him specifically responsible for what humanity became, Azazel. The text doesn't describe Azazel as one corrupter among many. It says the whole earth was corrupted through what he taught, and it uses a phrase translators render almost identically across manuscripts. To him is ascribed all sin. Not a share of it, all of it. Enoch has God command the angel Raphael to bind Azazel specifically, cover his face so he cannot see light, and hold him in that same location until the day of judgment, when he is cast into the fire. This is the moment that reframes everything you've heard so far. Payoff 1 told you the Antichrist isn't a man, it's a system. That's still true. But a system isn't the same thing as something without a source. Enoch traces the entire structure, the corrupted rulers, the worship of wealth, the false claim on the earth, back to one specific name the text holds accountable above all others. The system has a face after all. It's just not the face waiting at the end of history. It's the one already bound at the beginning of it. Go back to the question the title asked. Where does it come from, and who rules there? Enoch answers both, in order. The system isn't a single man who appears at the end of time. It's a recurring pattern of rulers who've existed in every generation the text describes. That pattern has a physical point of origin, a valley in the west, burning, holding the angels whose rebellion started the corruption in the first place. That system runs on power, mistaken for worship, wealth treated as security, and a claim on the earth its holders have never had the right to make. And on the day the text says all of that gets tested, none of it survives contact with something higher. But the text doesn't leave the valley empty of a name. It names Azazel, specifically, as the one all of it is ascribed to, the one bound in that place until judgment comes for him too. That's who rules there. Not a future figure still waiting to arrive. A name the text has already written down, already sentenced, already holding for the day it says is still coming. That's the answer the Book of Enoch gives to a question most people assume has no answer. Not a mystery still unfolding somewhere ahead of you. A place and a name, already on the record, in a book old enough to have been forgotten, and specific enough that it never should have been.